Hey everybody, welcome back to my channel. My name is Robert. Today is the second of our read-along videos, and it's the first from the list of 100 great books. And so we'll be talking about Edith Wharton's short novel, Ethan Frome, today. If you're familiar with Edith Wharton's works, most people have read either The House of Mirth, Ethan Frome, or The Age of Innocence. The Age of Innocence is probably considered her greatest work. Ethan Frome is a bit of an anomaly for Edith Wharton because most of what she writes about is the upper wealthy aristocratic class in New York City. Ethan Frome, however, is a big departure from that, so it's seen as a little bit different. She wrote virtually a novel a year for the peak of her career, and Ethan Frome is in the middle of her two great works. Her first major work, The House of Mirth, came out in 1905. Ethan Frome was published in 1911, and then The Age of Innocence in 1921. So there's a few years between each of them. But she keeps going back to some of the same themes over and over again in her works, and even though the setting and characters of Ethan Frome are different from some of her more aristocratic New York City novels of manners, she's still dealing with some of the same thematic ideas. This is going to have spoilers. There's no way to do these videos without spoilers, and I'll put that in the title of the video too, so you're forewarned ahead of time. So let me do a very quick summary of the story itself, in case it's been a while since you've read it, or if you've never read it and you're trying to decide if you want to read it. But I'm not going to protect you from the ending, so be aware of that. Ethan Frome is a young man who is from a small town in western Massachusetts, in the mountains of western Massachusetts. It's a fictional town of Starkfield. And he has a dream of breaking away from that home. He goes off to college, he wants to become an engineer, and he wants to live in the city. But when his father dies suddenly and his mother is taken ill, Ethan doesn't feel like he has a choice. He has to go back to Starkfield and take over the family farm, and he's somewhat trapped by that economically. And to help care for his failing mother, a distant cousin comes to help, and her name is Zenobia. She goes by Zeena most of the time. And when his mother does finally pass away, a combination of fear of being alone and is almost guilted into thinking that marrying Zeena is the right thing for him to do. So he does. He marries Zeena, and almost immediately it's clear that it's not a good marriage. She's disappointed that their life is going to be so small and prescribed. He's disappointed that he's having to give up all his dreams. They don't really care for each other that much, and very quickly Zeena becomes an invalid, but it's hypochondria. She's using that as a mask to hide her life. But she becomes an invalid and a hypochondriac, and Ethan is even more tied to taking care of her and the farm, and he realizes he's going to have to give up all of his aspirations, all of his dreams. When Zeena finds a doctor that tells her that she shouldn't be doing so much work around the house, she takes in a cousin of hers named Maddie Silver to help her. And Maddie is young, she's charming, she's beautiful, she's not particularly adept domestically, but they think that, she'll learn. And they're not really having to pay her, they're just having to pay for her room and board, basically. Ethan, however, falls in love with Maddie, and Maddie falls in love with Ethan, although they never really talk about it. It's just, these feelings that they express inarticulately. And Zeena figures it out pretty quickly, and she's miserable by this and wants to make both of them miserable. So she arranges for Maddie to be sent away. It's, after all, her relation, so she can send her away if she wants to. And Ethan can't bear to let Maddie go. And so on the day that she's supposed to be leaving, Ethan and Maddie take the long way to the train station, and they kind of reminisce about all the different things that they were supposed to be doing. And this is in the middle of winter. And they talk about the fact that they were planning to go coasting or sledding, but that had been put off by one thing and another. And so they find a sled laid out, and they go down this one big hill. And it's a dangerous hill because there's a giant elm right in the path that you have to navigate around, or you risk destruction. And they go down the hill, and it's wonderful and glorious. And they walk back up the hill, and they're about to say their farewells, and he's going to take her to the train station. And Maddie suggests they go down one more time. But she makes it clear that this time they're not going to miss the elm tree. She's essentially inviting him to commit suicide with her rather than to be separate from each other. And Ethan goes along with it, and they crash into this giant elm. Unfortunately for them, neither one is killed. They're both just crippled. And so they end up together, but they're in horrible circumstances, crippled, and under the care of Zeena, of all things. Now, the whole story is told from the point of view of an outsider who's in the town visiting and gets stuck there for a winter. He's doing an engineering job, and he has seen Ethan Frome, and he's in his 50s. It's 24 years after the smash up. So when you finally figure out their situation at the end, you realize this has been going on for 24 years. And he wants to know more about Ethan, but nobody really wants to talk about it. And then by chance, he ends up being a guest at Ethan's house one night because they get snowed in. And he starts to learn the story. And of course, the fact that he is the narrator of this story raises a lot of questions. Is what he's telling us in these 9 chapters, plus the prologue and the epilogue, is what he's telling us factual? Is it his interpretation of what he surmises from what he's been able to learn in these conversations? There's some questions raised there, but the story is what the story is. And so it's a tragedy for a number of reasons. When this book came out, the early critics of it were dismayed by the bleakness of the story and the inability of the characters to find some way out of their plight. But I really think Edith Wharton's using that as kind of the point of the tragedy, is that they are trapped in many ways. And it's not just Ethan. Ethan is obviously he's the title character, he's the focus of the story, and he is the one who most obviously is trapped by circumstances beyond his control again and again and again. But Zeena and Maddie are both trapped too, at least economically. I think Edith Wharton is making a commentary on the society that provides no economic opportunities for women. And as a result, their lives are miserable too. And so I don't think she's being as hateful to the women in this book as it has been suggested by some of the critics. My battery light just started flashing, so this may die in the middle of this, and I may have to come back and film the rest of it this afternoon. So there are a couple things that I want to talk about. The main ideas which show up in this book. She's also well known for her symbolism in this book, and of course the narrative point of view. But one of the things that's really important in this book is her use of irony, and it's pervasive in this novel. The red pickle dish, which ends up breaking and becoming a sign to Zeena that Maddie and Ethan are conspiring against her and in love. But it's a dish that's been treasured, but it's never used, but it's also the one that ends up broken. And it kind of becomes, thinking of symbolism ahead, it kind of becomes a symbol of Ethan and Zeena's marriage. The one meal that Ethan and Maddie get to share together without Zeena being there ends up in distress with this broken dish and the awareness that Zeena's going to find out. The ecstasy of this coasting adventure that they've been talking about for days and days and days ends up in tragedy when they crash into the elm, even though it's intentional the second time. The moment of almost renunciation when they choose suicide rather than eloping, knowing that financially they can't elope. It ends not in their glorious death and the end of their love in a Romeo and Juliet type of way, but it ends in years and years and years of misery and even closer ties to Zeena. And a lot of people have noticed that Ethan may be partly responsible for how mean Zeena was to him, because it's his goodness that allows her to become so cruel to him. So there's so many ironies in this book. Let's talk about three of the ideas that seem to be really essential main ideas or themes in this book. And the first one is what makes it a tragedy, and it's the tragedy of wasted lives. And I've already referred to this a little bit, but for Ethan, his life is completely different from what he imagined. He wants to become an engineer. He wants to live in a city where people do things and go places. He wants a different life from Starkfield. And he's pulled back by economic circumstances, by family obligations, by all sorts of things. And even when his parents die, he is almost guilted into marrying Zeena, and almost immediately it becomes clear that that was a bad idea, and that just strengthens his ties and obligations to Starkfield, and he can't break from them. One of the big ironies at the end of this is that Maddie almost turns into a Zeena-like figure at the end of the novel. 24 years after the smash-up, when this visitor comes into the house, Maddie and Zeena are sitting in the kitchen, and he's heard this voice complaining and whining, and it dawns on him that it's Maddie's voice that he has heard, and she sounds exactly like he has imagined Zeena being. So there's some really interesting juxtapositions at the end of this novel. Edith Wharton has been accused of being a misogynist at times, and her portrayal of women is not very flattering. But as I mentioned, I think she's also arguing that women have no choices either, and that they are trapped economically. And she's arguing that if marriage is the only path to happiness and fulfillment for women, it's going to be an unsatisfying journey for them, and it's going to make everybody's life more miserable, which is what Zeena's mission is to make Ethan more miserable. She just almost comes out and says it. The second big idea is that there's really no escape for any of these characters. Even at the very end, when Ethan says, all right, to hell with it, I'll run away with Maddie and go out west and just run away from everything. He can't bring himself to lie to the people he's trying to get some money from to do that. He can't bring himself to saddle Zeena with a farm full of debt. He knows economically that he's not capable of walking away from that obligation. And so he's trapped. There's no escape. And economically, as I've already mentioned, there's no escape for either Zeena or Maddie either. When Maddie thinks that she's leaving their farm, she has nowhere to go. She knows she's not going to get a job that's going to enable her to become independent. And she doesn't really have any relatives. So there's a lot of this sense of being trapped in this book. Well, sure enough, as I was afraid, my battery died in midstream, and so I'm going to pick up where I left off. I was just about to start with the third of the main ideas in this novel. And that idea is the difference between the characters' fantasies and their realities. And you can see this, of course, most clearly with Ethan. Ethan fails in his attempts to bring love and happiness and feeling into his life. All the times that he's with Maddie, he's imagining himself to be a better man. He's imagining what their future would be like. He imagines that them being married to each other would bring out her domestic skills. And yet, when you look at the reality, Ethan is virtually inarticulate when he's around Maddie. All these things that go through his head, he's not capable of saying. And Maddie doesn't really vocalize her thoughts either, although it's very clear to the two of them that they are in love and that it's an impossible love. Maddie also has her fantasies. The dinner that they share together without Zeena being present, Maddie puts an extra special ribbon in her hair. She brings out the best dishes. She's trying to set up a scene of domesticity that is her fantasy of them together at some point too. And of course it does not happen. And that reality is that it's never going to happen under those circumstances. Their realities are always very different from their fantasies. At one point, Ethan's walking by the graveyard and even fantasizes that when he and Maddie both die, they'll be buried next to each other happily ever after. And that may still prove to happen because they are linked now for the rest of their lives, just not in any way that they could have imagined. And Zeena uses the illusion of illness, her hypochondria, her being an invalid, to mask the reality of her loneliness and despair in her life as well. So all three of the characters have fantasies that are never going to be fulfilled, and that are in stark contrast to the realities of their economic straits, of their social and familial obligations. And it stresses how far from what they want that their lives actually are going to be. I mentioned already Wharton's use of symbolism here, and I just want to talk about very briefly 2 or 3 of the ones that are the most obvious. Even when I was teaching, I was never a huge one to harp on symbolism. It's either there or it's not, and trying to push it too far, I think, is always a mistake by teachers, as students are wont to tell you, the blue curtain's just a damn blue curtain. And so I'm going to focus just on a couple. One of the obvious ones is the name of the town that they live in, Starkfield. It's a fictional town, so it's not just coincidental that she chose that town name. Their lives are stark, they're bleak, it's winter, and they're characterized by isolation and a failing economy and everything else. This is right as the Industrial Revolution was starting to make changes in America. This book came out in 1911, and villages like Starkfield are struggling to keep up in the early 20th century's economy. The other part that I think can be seen as a symbol is the farmhouse itself, especially the kitchen of the farmhouse. It kind of becomes Ethan's prison. Eventually, it's going to become his tomb. He is tied to that farm through first his parents' reality. When they die, he's brought back to the farm. And then he's tied to it when he marries Zeena. He can't just sell it and go off to become an engineer like he wants to be. And then he's especially tied to it in that final scene of the book where the narrator and Ethan walk in and you see Zeena and Maddie sitting side by side. Excuse me, my papers are blown away. Sitting side by side in the kitchen, and you realize this has been their life for the past 24 years, and it's not going to change. This kitchen is basically become their world, and it's a grim, depressing prospect. And the third symbol I've already mentioned, and that's that red pickle dish. It gets broken, it's treasured, although it's never really used, and it becomes a symbol of the broken marriage between Zeena and Ethan. I've been torn in these videos, especially the ones from the 100 Great Books, that because I've taught these books and read these books so often in the past, I don't want to treat these videos as a classroom seminar where I just lecture for 2, 3, 4 hours on a book. That defeats the purpose. I really want to get feedback from any of you who have read it recently or have read it in the past and remember it, and how you feel about this. One of the things that surprised me is when I reread it this week, I posted on Twitter and Facebook how much I enjoyed the rereading of this, and almost immediately I heard from 2 women, one of whom is a former student of mine, who said that she hated this book when she read it in high school. It wasn't in the class that she had with me, thank goodness, in high school, but it was about the same, within a year or two of when I taught her. She hated it. She didn't really say why too much, but she just had such a viscerally negative reaction to it. And then a teaching colleague of mine, a history teacher, not an English teacher, also wrote that when she read it in college, she hated it too. Although she realizes with the distance of time that reading it now in our 50s is probably very different from reading it in our late teens and early 20s. So it's foolish for me to assume that my reaction to these books is going to be universal in any way. So I really do want to hear from you all. Okay, so I'll leave it there. Please put your comments here. There is a message board on Goodreads. If you don't have a channel on YouTube or don't want to go into a lengthy discussion here, you're free to use the message board at Goodreads. It's kind of just a secondary place to talk if that's more convenient for you technologically. Let's look ahead at what's coming up. Read along number 3 is when we switch to the 20th century backlist titles, and the first one we'll read there next week, starting tomorrow, is a collection of short stories by Amy Bloom called Come to Me. And then the following week, the end of our first cycle of read-alongs will be the nonfiction selection, and that's Matthew Desmond's, I just went blank on the title. Oh, Evicted, about poverty in American cities. And so looking a full month ahead, the June selection from the 100 Great Books list will be one of the very few nonfiction works on that list, and we'll be reading Henry David Thoreau's Walden. So if you are interested in any of those that are coming up, I'll put the links in the description box to both my website page with the calendars for each of the lists, and I'll put a link to the Goodreads group. You're welcome to join that and make conversation there as well as here. If you have your own BookTube channel and you want to make a reaction video, I would love to see it. Please let me know, make sure I don't miss it. Otherwise, feel free to put any comments below you have about this book or questions. Okay, that's it for me. I will see you again on Tuesday, probably with a tag video, and we'll go from there. Have a good, what's left of the weekend, have a good weekend, and I'll see you soon, everybody. Bye.